Good morning. This is the fourth lecture of the last testing period in History 2303. We're rapidly getting toward the end of the course. When we talked last time, we finished the third, we finished the third lecture, acknowledging that landslide Lyndon went to Washington with a great 87 vote margin in the 1948 senatorial election in Texas. That election, along with Harry Truman's re-election in 1948, really was the hallmark or the high point, or perhaps even the low point, of Texas politics in 1948. It was after the 1948 election wars between Johnson and Coke Stevenson and Harry Truman with his Republican and Dixiecrat challengers, along with the progressive Henry Wallace, that in 1949 the Texas legislature enacted many positive laws. A state mental health hospital supervision law was reformed. An anti-lynch law was passed in the state of Texas. The prison system was modernized, and the schools were reorganized through the Gilmer-Aiken law. The 51st legislature also saw the first $1 billion biennial budget for Texas. The first time two-year budget for Texas totaled or exceeded $1 billion. When the conservative legislature refused to increase taxes, Governor Buford Jester, had to veto some appropriations in order to balance the budget. The prison system increased in size from 29%, increased in size by 29% from 1945 to 1946. And the prison system was hopelessly outdated. It was in badly need of improving. Likewise, Texas schools, by the end of the Second World War, schools needed more appropriations to provide quality education for an ever-increasing juvenile population. Beginning in at the end of World War II, we had what was called the baby boomer generation. That's my generation. And we would have a glut of babies and small children. For the next 12 years, almost every year, you would find schools having to be built in all communities of America to facilitate this large increase in the number of juveniles going to school, particularly elementary school. In 1949, a law was passed to establish an elective Board of Education for the state of Texas to supervise the Texas Education Agency. A second law set 9 months as the length of the school term, and a third law established a formula whereby schools would be supported both by state and local funding, with more state funds going to poorer school districts. This is the origins of the Robin Hood laws that have affected education in Texas for many years. The idea that poorer school districts ought to be somehow supported by the state, and that affluent school districts that have the money and tax base in order to raise revenues somehow ought to share the wealth with the poorer school districts. On July the 11th of 1949, Texans woke up to learn that their beloved governor, Buford Jester, had fallen dead to a heart attack. And Allen Shivers, lieutenant governor, 41 years of age, now was the new governor of Texas. The legislature was called into special session by Shivers in 1950, given Jester's prior veto of a second-year appropriation for the biennium of 1949-1950. Conservative Shivers surprised the Texas establishment, the conservatives in Texas, by calling for additional taxes, which is something that conservatives rarely ever call for in the state of Texas, as a way to satisfy the increasing appropriations or increasing expenditures of the state. And The truth is that he, Alan Shivers, urged the creation of the Legislative Budget Board, the LBB. And the LBB was a new and novel concept. Before 1949, the state did not have a budget. Each biennium, every 2 years, each department submitted a memo requesting revenues for the next 2 years. The governor then decided which requests and how much would be forwarded to the legislature for consideration. So in this case, by being fiscally responsible and supporting the Legislative Budget Board, Shivers weakened the governor's position in Texas by shifting budgeting issues away from the governor and into the hands of legislative peoples like the Speaker of the House and the Texas Lieutenant Governor, who rapidly, after the passage of the Legislative Budget Board, became the two most important legislators in the state of Texas. In his very famous goat speech of January 1950, new Governor Alan Shivers noted that Texas was first in oil, but last in mental hospitals, first in cotton, but last in the care of those suffering from tuberculosis, first in the number of goats raised in the state of Texas, in the nation, but last in caring for the state's wards, folks who could not provide for themselves. And Alan Shivers said, quote, "If we're going to appropriate in the spring, we must tax in the winter. Just as one is going to raise a crop during the summer, one has to go back and plant in the spring and allow those crops to grow to be harvested." So Governor Shivers said, if we're going to appropriate in the spring, we must tax in the winter. Modest tax increases resulted as a result of the governor's support of taxation, and generally that went to increased appropriations for hospitals and colleges in the state of Texas. The 52nd Texas Legislature, meeting in 1951, taxed even more, providing taxes on consumer goods to raise revenues for new roads, higher education, specifically teacher salaries, a state retirement program, and more assistance to the elderly. But the governor opposed the legislature's proposed tax on natural gas pipelines, as did Texas Attorney General John Shepard. When the United States Supreme Court ruled pipeline tax unconstitutional, its supporters noted that the Texas Attorney General did not vigorously defend the state law. The 52nd Legislature also redistricted the state for the first time in 30 years, and quite controversial was a law which the legislature passed requiring annual automobile inspections and providing for auto liability insurance. Until 1951, you could drive around without liability insurance, and you didn't have to have your car annually inspected. So that meant that people's brake pads wore out and they were driving around in unsafe cars, etc. And the legislature in 1952, the 52nd legislature in 1951 passed an auto annual inspections and provided for automobile liability insurance. In 1952, conservative Governor Shivers took control of the Texas State Democratic Executive Committee, purging liberals from the committee since they tended to support Truman and integration. As a result, Governor Shivers backed Dwight David Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, in 1952, charging outgoing administration Harry S. Truman with administrative corruption, involvement in a no-win Korean War, and claiming that the federal government tended to dominate the state's tidelands. And the tideland issue was very important in this 1952 election. The tidelands were underwater in the Gulf of Mexico, areas adjacent to the state's coastline. The state of Texas claimed that since she had once been an independent nation state, a republic, that she controlled 3 marine leagues, that's 10.5 miles out from the coastline out into the Gulf of Mexico, and that the state of Texas owned the land all the way out from the coast to 10.5 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. The federal government had not disputed that until the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, in 1937, ruled that all underwater lands past 3 miles belonged to the federal government. When World War II ended, rich deposits of petroleum were found in the area from 3 to 10.5 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico, along the Florida and Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas coasts throughout the Gulf of Mexico. In 1946, conservative Texan Congressman Hatton Sumner of Texas, again, sponsored a congressional law that granted Texas claim to 10.5 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. But Harry S. Truman vetoed it, and that action grossly offended the Texas regular conservatives. In 1947, the United States Supreme Court, in a California case, ruled that the federal government exercised paramount control over disputed offshore lands. But United States Attorney General Tom Clark of Texas responded, refusing to lease Texas tidelands to oil companies. When the Democratic presidential nominee in 1952, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, refused to endorse Texas' claim to the tidelands in that area from 3 to 10.5 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico, Governor Shivers committed to support Dwight David Eisenhower, who did endorse Texas and the other southern states owning the lands from 3 to 10.5 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. Such a revolt worked because Alan Shivers in 1951 convinced the Texas legislature to pass a law allowing for cross-filing of public office, that is, listing the same candidate on both the Democratic and Republican Party ballots. That allowed Texas conservative Democrats for the next 2 years much latitude in political maneuvering. And in the presidential race in 1952, the more liberal Democratic Lyndon Johnson Rayburn forces supported Adlai Stevenson, but did not vigorously campaign for him. The conservative Shivercrats, as they were referred to, Shivercrat conservative candidates won over the more liberal candidates on the ticket. For instance, Shivers himself was reelected by 400,000 votes more over his liberal Austin lawyer opponent, Ralph Yarber. Texas Republicans supported the Shivercrats, content with Ike carrying Texas in hopes of getting Republican patronage and support for the tidelands. The election of Ike ensured Texas would hold on to its tidelands, but it did not promote the growth of a viable Republican Party in the 1950s. Conservative Democrats would oppose Ike's refusal to endorse Joe McCarthy, opposed Ike's commitment of sending troops to Little Rock to integrate the public schools in 1957, and opposed Ike's support of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. So Texas Republicans remained, and Texas conservatives remained outside the Republican Party. And it wasn't until John Tower was elected in 1961 that a modern Republican Party of Texas was born. Frustration over foreign affairs and fear of internal subversion at home resulted nationally in a Red Scare during the Truman administration. This Red Scare was often referred to as the era of McCarthyism. In Texas, Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy's supporters were right-wing, militant conservatives, willing to believe almost anything about anyone. Except for a legislative requirement supporting loyalty oaths for all public employees and politicians' lofty pledges of patriotism, the Red Scare had little effect on state affairs. But in local elections, the Red Scare had a great impact. The issue dominated in local elections. Agitators demanded, for instance, that public and school libraries be purged of books sympathetic to communism or socialism, or those written by John Dos Passos, who was suspected of being a socialist. Educators with socialist tendencies were fired, and those who questioned the status quo were silenced, were forced into silence. A major anti-communist Texan was United States General Edwin Walker, a native of Center Point, Texas, as a matter of record, right down the way from us. One communist sympathizer was found among 65,000 public school teachers and was fired in Texas. But not much more was accomplished. When a CIO retail employee strike in Port Arthur in 1954 was deemed a communist conspiracy by Alan Shivers, the governor, called a special session of the legislature and requested a bill that would make Communist Party membership punishable by death, believe it or not. The legislature of Texas balked at that, but did place a $20,000 fine and a 20-year prison term on those belonging to the American Communist Party. A subsequent film on the strike in Port Arthur called The Port Arthur Story helped Ralph Yarborough in 1954, helped to ruin Ralph Yarborough's attempt to unseat Shivers in 1954 as governor of Texas. The 1950s was also an important time for black advancement in Texas. By outlawing the all-white Texas primary in 1944, the United States Supreme Court closed the door to black participation in politics. Yet, by 1958, with 50% of potential white voters registered, only 1/3 of Texas black voters were registered. Integration, however, was another matter, integrating society into just one society, not white nor black. As significant as Sweat versus Painter, the Supreme Court case in 1950, more sweeping was the case of Brown versus Topeka, the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. The United States Supreme Court ruled, based on the 14th Amendment, that segregation itself deprived children of minority groups, regardless of whether the schools were as good as those for whites. The United States Supreme Court expressed a willingness to move slowly, however, as it applied its ruling and left the approach and solution to integration to the lower courts and to the states. Reaction to Brown versus Topeka split on racial lines in Texas. Whites opposed the ruling by 4-1. Blacks favored the ruling by 2-1. Announced during the 1954 state primaries, liberal Ralph Yarborough refused to condemn the Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas decision. His opponent, conservative Governor Alan Shivers, eventually charged Yarborough as supporting a completely integrated society, to the point where Governor Shivers called Ralph Yarborough, well, he used the N-word to describe Ralph Yarborough, that he was a lover of integration. After Shivers' re-election, the governor and the new Attorney General of Texas, John Ben Shepherd, then endorsed interposition, the concept of interposition, to block federal mandated integration on the local level. Concept of interposition is simply this. It is the concept that what if the national government passes a law that harms the people of a state? Should not the officials of the state step forward and block the impact of a bad federal law on the citizens of a state? That's interposition. And that was the argument, that the state of Texas would somehow say, no, we don't like that ruling, and we're not going to enforce that ruling in the state of Texas. But you can't allow interposition. You can't allow states to pick and choose what national laws that each state wants, because pretty soon you're going to find a hodgepodge of rulings. In one state, one national law would be legal, but another one wouldn't be illegal, would be legal, and others would be illegal in other states, etc. And uniformity of law goes out the window with interposition. Interposition is a step toward secession and withdrawing from the Union. So interposition was a silly concept, but the state of Texas attempted it to block the integration of society in Texas. In 1956, in the Democratic state primary, several segregationist issues were submitted to Texas voters. A majority of Texas voters in 1956 voted to oppose mixed race marriages, supported exemptions for whites from attending integrated schools, and they supported the concept of interposition by the state of Texas. Some violence toward integration did occur in Texas. Threats of violence occurred when blacks attempted to integrate the Mansfield School District near Fort Worth, and Alan Shivers sent Texas Rangers to restore order, although blacks were not allowed to enroll at the Mansfield School. Yet by 1957, there were over 220 Texas school districts out of an estimated 1,000 independent school districts that carried out peacefully some degree of integration, and that included the public schools of Kerrville, Texas, that were peacefully integrated without any trouble. But opposition to integration did not die easily. In 1957, the Texas state legislature passed a law that required mandatory consent of school district voters before integration could occur. A majority of the voters of a school district had to agree to integration before it could occur. If the majority did not, state funding would be withheld from any district that attempted integration. Another state law called for closing any district at which either federal or state troops were stationed. These laws only delayed the inevitable integration of schools by the court system. Conservative Democrat Price Daniel Sr., elected in 1956, made no further attempt to impose state authority against the federal government, i.e. he did not support interposition, and after 1957, integration went forward fairly well in the state of Texas. It was during this time that Mexican Americans, Hispanics in Texas, also advanced. After World War II, Dr. Hector Garcia of Corpus Christi, Texas, founded the American GI Forum for Hispanic Veterans. And the GI Forum became very actively involved in poll tax drives, the establishment of scholarships for Tejanos, and encouraged Hispanic political involvement. In 1948, a court decision ruled the segregation of Mexican Americans in public schools as unconstitutional. And in 1951, the courts ruled against the exclusion of Mexican Americans on juries. In 1956, San Antonio went so far as to elect Henry B. Gonzalez to the state legislature, to the state senate, the first of his race elevated to the Texas Senate in modern times. Gonzalez would subsequently win a seat in Congress and serve for some 20 years with distinction. Scandals also rocked Texas in the mid to late 1950s, particularly in the insurance field. Texas insurance laws were lax and had left the door open for fly-by-night promoters and operators to come into Texas. I have a note here that says after World War II, there were more insurance companies operating in Texas than all other states of the Union combined. So Texas was just rife with fly-by-night insurance companies. Insurance company failures were common. From 1945 to 1955, 86 Texas insurance companies failed. And in 1955, the Texas legislature enacted 22 laws on the subject of insurance operations in Texas, providing specifically for more effective regulation under a board of insurance commissioners. The failures continued, particularly the United Services Trust and Guarantee Company, a Texas-based large holding company of 74 insurance and finance companies that operated in 23 states. The legislative investigation of the failure of United Services Trust and Guarantee Company discovered an unhealthy relationship between Texas insurance companies and the Texas state government. For instance, of the 31 Texas state senators, 9 received free legal advice and other income from United Services Trust and Guarantee Company. The legislature then forced all Texas insurance companies to submit to an audit, and subsequently more than 100 Texas insurance companies folded their doors or were denied permits to continue business in the state of Texas. When members of the Texas Insurance Board illegally accepted gifts from ICT Insurance Company, Ben Jack Cage, the founder of ICT, Ben Jack Cage was indicted for bribery and wound up fleeing to Brazil that did not have an extradition treaty at the time with the United States. During the 1956 Texas gubernatorial race, Ralph Yarborough, opposing United States Senator Price Daniel, charged that Daniel, along with Governor Shivers, with irresponsibility in the operations of the Veterans Land Board, because both Senator Price Daniel and Governor Shivers were ex officio members to the Veterans Land Board. Subsequent investigation by the legislature and several Austin grand juries resulted in the indictment and the conviction of Texas Commissioner of General Land Office Bascom Giles on charges of misrepresentation and perjury. Giles was sentenced to the state penitentiary for 6 years. His supporters painted Giles as a fall guy for Senator Daniels and Governor Shivers. The Governor Shivers' popularity in the polls as a result of the Giles conviction dropped in 1955 from 64% favorable to only 22% supporting the governor. And Cuero Record newspaper reporter Kenneth Towery won a Pulitzer Prize for investigation of the scandal that led to the prosecution of Bascom Giles. In the 1956 election, Senator Daniels defeated Yarborough in the August runoff primary for governor. Then, Yarborough defeated several candidates to fill Daniels' vacated United States Senate seat. So, you had some political maneuvering going on in the state of Texas as a result of the conservative-liberal fights. In the final years of the 1950s, liberal Democrats, concerned over the war and how Yarborough was treated in the 1954 primary, began to organize, and Mrs. R.D. Frankie Randolph of Houston financed the publication of a liberal Democratic newspaper called the Texas Observer. The Texas Observer was initially edited by Austinite Ronnie Duggar. Some liberals reached out to even Jerry Holloman, the president of the Texas CIO, and others to form what was called the Democrats of Texas, DOT. So the liberals of Texas reached out to labor unions and formed an organization called Democrats of Texas, DOT. These liberals opposed the poll tax, and they demanded liberal representation in Texas Democratic Party affairs, and they supported adherence to the more liberal Democratic National Party. It was largely DOT, Democrats of Texas, that ensured Ralph Yarborough's 1956 election to fill Daniels' vacated U.S. Senate seat, and Yarborough's 1958 victory to a full United States Senate term. Yet liberals didn't control the Texas State Executive Committee, an entity controlled for the rest of the 1950s by Johnson, LBJ, Daniel conservative wing of the Texas Democratic Party. Texas Republican Party continued to flounder, daring not to oppose Lyndon Johnson and these conservatives, given Johnson and Sam Rayburn's control over Ike's national legislative agenda. By 1958, Texas Republicans could elect only one United States congressman, and that was Bruce Alger of Dallas, Texas. While governor, Price Daniel was more popular with the people than the legislature. Daniel legislature conflicted, especially over taxes. The governor opposed a general sales tax for the state of Texas. He wanted more sin taxes, taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and more taxes on business interests. But after two special legislatures in 1961, the legislature passed a limited sales tax of 2%, and the law went into effect without the governor's signature. The 1961 passage of the sales tax set a standard. Throughout the 1960s, subsequent legislatures would increase the sales tax and lower business taxes in Texas. To promote the political aspirations of LBJ, Daniel also convinced the legislature to move the primaries to May and change the convention system so that Lyndon Johnson, senator from Texas, name could appear on the ballot both as an incumbent candidate for United States Senator while simultaneously pursuing the 1960 presidential Democratic nomination. That was to protect Johnson's political career in Texas in case his presidential aspirations in 1960 failed. So lots of political maneuvering in the 1950s in Texas, lots of scandals, lots of concerns in the insurance industry and about integration of society. But this brings us to a close. This is a good place to stop this particular tape. And when we come in next time, this is the end of the fourth tape, we'll do a fifth tape on the transitional 1960s in Texas, because Texas really did change politically and socially and economically in the 1960s. But for now, I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Have a good day. See you later.